The left is always inclined to look on the grim side of things. Always inclined to look on the grim side of things. The cup is always half empty. Until you point out, look, it's half full. It doesn't look so bad.
Welcome to Political Gingervitis, the crazy and zany podcast for progressives who need a laugh. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and this week we're going to try to put a smile on your face and maybe a few thoughts in your head.
Here's John Ossoff speaking to supporters in North Atlanta, Georgia.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, everybody. I love you too. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay. A few moments ago, my friends, I called Secretary Handel.
Loser! You're a loser! Are you feeling sorry for yourself?
I commended her on a hard-fought race and on her victory this evening. Now,
You are dirt! You make me sick, you big baby! Baby want a bottle? A big dirt bottle?
as darkness has crept across this planet,
Lousy Democrats.
have provided a beacon of hope for people here in Georgia, for people across the country, and for people around the world. This small community in Georgia, which has become the epicenter of politics, sometimes to my chagrin,
Do I dare live out the American dream?
for months now. And it's had nothing to do with me. It never had.
Boring.
It's about you.
Organized crime.
It's about an extraordinary community at an extraordinary moment in history.
Oh my God!
The first opportunity in this country to make a statement about values that can still unite people.
Am I turning you on?
At a time when politics has been dominated by fear
What about the wiener?
and hatred
Give it!
and scapegoat
Jerk ass!
and division.
Loser! You're a loser!
Welcome again, folks, to another thrilling episode today of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, here with another chance to make you laugh and think about progressive politics and activism in the Trump era. So, as we move forward into a summertime that is already looking like it will shape up to be full of opportunities to protest and demonstrate against various policies coming out of both imperial war parties, we're going to begin having a conversation about a tactic which is known as the United Front. United fronts are built up between various left progressive forces and parties and are usually composed so to challenge an extreme right-wing leadership in a given country. The most famous and unfortunately rather infamous also was the hypothetical one proposed by Leon Trotsky that would have been composed of the German Socialists and the Communist Party that rather unfortunately never materialized because of the machinations of Joseph Stalin. So, as we go forward, we're going to be talking about this from both a practical and historical perspective with a variety of guests that can offer insights about who to talk with about this united front and why we should be building one, how to go about building it, and some of the more surprising people that might be found inside of a united front in opposition to these policies and actions within the governing elite. So, first up is a clip from the beginning of the Bush administration featuring Alexander Coburn in Seattle.
The other thing, along with the fundamental target of creative liberty, is allies. I sometimes think that our crowd is a little closed off as to who you can work with. For example, the libertarians. Now, the libertarians are not great on everything. Like I often say to them, I'd be with you on something, your views on child slavery I don't totally approve of. What do you mean? I say, well, you know, you're in favor of no laws and restraints on exploitation, you know, in the interest of the free market. So you want to put a little anklet around a kid of 9 and make him pull a coal trolley down a mine? Well, I don't really mean that. But libertarians are good on some things. They don't like wars. Some of the best stuff on intervention on the war on terror, if you go to antiwar.com, which is a libertarian site, you'll read great stuff. Out there in what is normally, so many times I've gone to a city and people say, boy, it's really conservative here. Someone said it actually about Spokane. It's a very conservative country. I've been to 100 towns where people always say that. And then you start inquiring what's going on, and there's always something going on. Always something going on. There's always a church group, a labor group, a community group. And there's also a whole bunch of people who might be called conservative who are pissed off, just like we are. Totally pissed off. They know the system is loaded against them. They know that food support programs go to just the rich farm corporations, if they're farmers in the country. They know the fix is in. It's a matter of figuring out the language and the issues in which you can share with them. That's not an impossible thing to do. And sometimes, so to speak, our side forgets that.
Our job is to discuss the rise of movements that challenge repressive institutions and discourses. Any kind of discussion like that has to talk about who is the enemy and what is the enemy up to and what are the people's forces doing about that enemy and his shenanigans. Who are the allies and who are the potential allies of the people. And we have to decide what forces can usefully be called part of the people's movement. This past year has seen huge developments. These have been history-shaking events, and I think history will tell us that. Events that have had a very deep impact on the political landscape and an impact on the prospects of defeating the main enemy of humanity. And of course, that main enemy is U.S. imperialism in its global and its domestic manifestations. And those global and domestic manifestations are not just interrelated, they are inextricable. You cannot separate them. I believe that the most far-reaching development in the past year has been the destabilization of the duopoly political system in the United States, and that has resulted in the Democratic Party becoming, and I'm stealing somebody else's quote here, the Democrats becoming the truly explicit party of the ruling class in the United States. And as such an explicitly ruling class party, the Democratic Party has been definitively become the most aggressive war party. This definitive war party coalesced. We actually saw it come together this past election season. And it came together in that big nasty tent that Hillary Clinton used as a headquarters in her campaign. Trump disrupted, or at least temporarily defeated, the Republican Party's establishment. But that's not what really upset and put into panic the ruling class. He also assembled a mass movement, and that mass movement was brought together based on what seemed to be his promise to create an even more virulently white, racist, white man's party than the Republican Party has been. The ruling class has been quite fine with having one party whose principle in terms of organizing the masses is white supremacy, and having another one in which the other folks are in. And it funds both of them. So that's not what destabilized the U.S. duopoly system. What destabilized the system was when Mr. Trump, rhetorically at least, made noises about lessening tensions with Russia and ending U.S. Regime change policies. And he also made noises about doing something about the free flow of money and jobs to foreign destinations, which seemed to ruling class ears to link him in some kind of alignment with the insurgency that was going on in the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders. It was Donald Trump's lack of trustworthiness, however, on foreign policy that was really key to the panic that set in among the ruling class. Donald Trump was not seen as being trustworthy on the issue of continuing U.S. war policies, and that made him into anathema for the bulk of the ruling class.
That was Glenn Ford at this year's 2017 Left Forum in New York. Next, we're going to turn to a conversation I had with Don DeBar. He is the host of CPR Radio, and he is going to describe what he has seen on the horizon as potential allies in a position that might strike some as quite out of the ordinary. Don, you were at the Republican and Democratic national conventions last year, and it was at the Democratic conventions in particular that you and Tony Montero saw quite an impressive show of activism and force come out into the streets. So what is your feeling from that towards the last 6 months since the election?
There were all kinds of characterizations of what was happening inside the Democratic primaries with these folks that lifted Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders wasn't supposed to be a real candidate, and Bernie Sanders, in all likelihood, by every measure other than the official one, actually won the Democratic primaries. That wasn't supposed to happen. Trump certainly wasn't supposed to happen. And yet no one is asking these kinds of questions even now. June, this is the 6th month of the Trump presidency. or it soon will be on the 20th. And so anyway, it's a very good question. You have to start with the fact that even going back to 2008, there were unprecedented rejections at many levels, in almost every sphere. It could be measured of the old ways of doing things. They elected a black guy in 2008. Not for nothing. That doesn't mean anything to me, but to America, that is not just novel. That's historic. It shouldn't be, but factually it is. People were so angry with their condition, with the non-responsiveness or the complicity or, in any event, the role of the institutions, from the government to Wall Street to everything, political parties, the media. We're so fed up and done with all of it after really one or two generations, maybe even three, of not just declining satisfaction of expectations that people had, but really complete failure of the system to provide responses for the things that people were brought up to request. And so, when Trump ended up getting elected last year, honestly, I wasn't surprised by it at all. And I have to lay the blame for that, or the credit, in Professor Montero's lap, Tony Montero, because he was the first one that actually had me looking at Trump's candidacy and Sanders' candidacy, not just as political campaigns representing whatever little fragments they were assembling as candidates, because there's that whole game that goes on. There's you got the two discrete coalitions, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. That's what they're called. And people have the rules inside each of them to become the nominee, and then the rules that make you the president or whatever office you're running for. They don't exactly correspond to the people in my community decided to put this person up for office, and they coordinated with the people here, there, whatever, and they're up, and here's their program. That's why we're with them, etc. It has nothing to do with any of that. There's a whole other thing that goes on here. I won't go into it, but this is sort of like a self-operative process that's disconnected from the public, other than looking for reification at the ballot box during the primary and November for that. So everybody thought Trump couldn't possibly win, but I thought it was quite possible, because Montero had said essentially what you have to look at is not Trump or Sanders or Clinton or any of these other people, and not even these claims of like some new fascist uprising that is the second coming of 1932 in Germany or whatever, but rather you have to take a look at the sociological phenomena that is, manifesting in the United States now. If Donald Trump is a fascist, this is the question he asked me, I don't know, a year and a half ago or whatever, that first lit me up. If Donald Trump is a fascist, what is Hillary Clinton? And what does she, more importantly, represent? And the answer to that was a very difficult one to, provide, absent an admission nested within it that, well, we are already within a fascist condition. If you look at the various touch points of our current way of life, forget the textbook definitions of fascism. There's a hero worship. There's overt militarism. You have to goose step. You have to have the captain of the football team say a prayer of homage to Hitler, whatever it is. There's all kinds of silly stuff that people use as markers, but the relevant things are left out. The fascism in the 30s was a response to the collapse of the capitalist system at that point in time, the state of flux of the imperial system that was really at the core of the capitalist system, but not really acknowledged or understood by many people, with the exception of the very few, like Lenin, for writing about it at the time. And that was kind of at the dawn of this whole thing that ended up unfolding from the post-World War I era till last Tuesday. And so, as we look at the phenomenon in 2016 of a fully expressed American century, or except temporally because it was only 70 years or whatever, but all of these things that the United States, as of, or not even the United States, but the rulers of the Western construct became pretty much absolute rulers of the world, or sort of unchallenged rulers of the world in 1989, 1991. Everybody thought that was the end of history, for example, Fukuyama, right? And yet, they started writing history like crazy around 2007, 2008, when the economic system collapsed. A lot of history written in between, by the way. We'll leave that alone for the moment. And, we got to a point where suddenly, not only were people raising questions about the Western system, but the people in the belly of the beast were raising existential questions, not only challenging, but doubting the legitimacy of all of the institutions, of the economic system, of the political system, of the media, of education, as their kids or they themselves were in debt to 6 or 7 figures, their housing evaporating, all of their wealth evaporating, the middle class evaporating, the whole basis of belief in the myth and or reality of that which came before, evaporates, and many other things are in motion and in flux coming into 2008 election, where again they elected the black guy who ran against Wall Street, even though he was not actually doing it in the back room in September of 2008, and et cetera. But everybody thought, there's still people driving around with peace signs in the O of Obama, for example, thinking that he was going to end the wars. Not what he did. So when you get to 2016, you have Sanders saying, well, we saw this in the polling. Every time they called for 2008, every time they called Obama a socialist, he went up in the polls among people under 35, I think, maybe even under 50. They were even commenting on that on CNN back in 2008. It was just like a phenomenological event. What is this? They say socialist, we say yeah. They say socialist, we say yeah, in the polls. So this time, Bernie Sanders is running. Everybody calls him a socialist. Forget what he is. That's what they called him. He's rising. That was something that was unexpected at the very least. There was no support for that position in the media. As the 2007, whatever, 2008, 2009, as that crisis developed, there was no official media presentation of socialism as an alternative. I mean, you didn't have the landscape, the media landscape that you had in the late 20s, early 30s, when you had the stock market crash in 29, everything that led into Roosevelt and New Deal. There was no media landscape like that here. No support for that. And yet, when people call, Sanders, they had an idea of him as a socialist, he rose up. Trump starts talking about the trade agreements. Now, he has a record, first of all. I mean, I'm here in New York. We know people, some of us have friends, when their kids were Central Park 5, Trump takes out a full-page ad in 1989, I think it was. These kids were innocent, accused of, beating up, whatever, injuring this Central Park jogger. And Trump takes out a full-page ad calling for them to be executed. It turned out to be innocent. We know who this guy is. I've been to meetings where he's trying to build a luxury apartment complex that's going to gentrify this city, here in Westchester County. I'm out there organizing. I know who this guy is. He comes out and says, let's do away with NAFTA. Let's deal with it anyway, because it's bad for us. Let's deal with TPP. Let's deal with these other things. Let's not have a war with Russia. Isn't that a good idea to not have a nuclear war? Let's do away with the idea of regime change. Let's work on making this country better. And instead of it being the only country in the world, let's make it the best country in the world, among others, and sit down and deal with everybody else. He gets lifted in the Republican Party over that. Same way Sanders gets lifted over being a quote-unquote socialist. And then, of course, the backdrop to all of that is for the last several years, really going back at least to the Occupy people in 2011, people are in the street in this country. Like, really, let's go back before that. Let's go back to, the million or 3 or 5 or 10 that went into the streets for May Day. Was it 2007 with the immigrants' rights people that surprised everyone with that? So, you have a whole lot of organized and or quote-unquote spontaneous, well-produced from, lots of processes, rebellion in essence. And so Trump ends up getting elected in the middle of all of that, despite the actual aggressive, overt efforts of the entire political and media establishment less than a year ago. That's what led us to where we are right now. And the real point of departure that you can see evident, I don't know what goes on in the back room, but, they squawk about him saying this about immigrants or that about Muslims or that about this, or the other thing. But the real problem they've got and the drum they're beating has to do with Russia, the other nuclear superpower. Trump says we should not be antagonistic towards, but whether he means it or not, is what he said. When people voted for him on, Tony and I were at the Republican National Convention. We saw the standing ovation over this stuff from the assembled thousands of Republicans. Let's not have war with Russia. Standing ovation, yay. Let's not have regime change. Standing ovation, yay, etc. That's what he said. The opposition to him across the board on TV, turn it on now. Steve Forbes on Fox right now. Whatever channel you go to, that's bad. Russia's bad. You can't talk about having peace with Russia. We should be kicking their butt. That's where we are right now.
Gotcha. So one of the antecedents to Trump's campaign, at least from my observation and having looked at the factors in up close and personal sense, is that he really tapped into the populist anti-war current that Ron Paul's campaigns did, and really seemed, at least to me, to mimic a lot of the verbiage that you find on websites like Justin Raimondo's antiwar.com. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I agree completely, first of all. It is. It's very much the same thing. One of the things that, I hate to use the terms, people here and in Russia and other places characterize the people that are attacking Trump over Russia and that are attacking the idea of peace between the United States and Russia. They characterize them as the left or liberals or whatever, which I think is an error, not a tactical error, but an error, in fact. They're not the left. The real left recognizes the fact that war making, development of war-making capacity, these are all things that steal from the working class and the poor. And consequently, and that, wars based on the class interests of the bourgeoisie are to be fought at all costs. And imperialism is to be fought at all costs. That's where the left lives. The people that oppose Trump over his policy in Russia, that's not the left. No matter what they call themselves, and no matter what the corporate media, for example, the media that is owned by GE, or the media that is owned by Time Warner, or the media that is, et cetera, no matter what that media says, they have no authority, power, magic, whatever, to make people who are making excuses for imperialism or enabling imperialist war and or the theft of resources from workers to promote those things left. They're not left. All right. So just to be clear on that particular point, when you see someone talk about democratic Syrian opposition, the same one that the U.S. government invokes in an effort to destroy the elected, legitimate government of Syria, the one seated at the United Nations. Those that are supporting that project are supporting imperialism. They are not on the left, no matter what they call themselves. They can call themselves a Vaz. They can call themselves, whatever. They're not left. But, okay, having that little definition of terms clarified some. What we're looking at in terms of the struggle in Washington right now, we're seeing it played out in a variety of arenas. We've got, I was listening to someone on Pacifica on my way over here that was talking about the absolute necessity to have Trump removed so that people understand that the Constitution and the law reign supreme in the United States. And that Trump, according to this person, has been in violation of the U.S. Constitution's emolument clause since he took office. That has to do with, according to some, maybe actually read the legislative intent. There was a discussions at the Constitutional Convention, and they're actually available on the internet. You might not agree with what these people are representing, but whatever. The emoluments clause is essentially something, or because there are several actually clauses, references to the Constitution, where federal officials are not supposed to be in the pay or employ of foreign governments or some others that could exert undue influence. And they claim, Trump rents out some of the hotels that he has his name on, he gets licensed from. They rent out to, say, Chinese government officials. Therefore, China's government has influence. So this is a constitutional violation, so he should be impeached. These same geniuses that are pulling out their slide rules and, their Latin dictionaries and, some lawyer that went to law school last week at Yale or whatever, while they're working on that, they kind of missed the war crimes that were committed by Obama in 2011 against Libya. Not just war crimes, but, we're talking about Nuremberg-level war crimes. The destruction of a nation, the killing of human beings, in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. The population of the country declined by 2 million, for example, in the period from March to October 20th. The United States Air Force was bombing that country. No questions about, constitutional questions, that there was no congressional vote, for example, and that the United States is a signatory to the UN Charter, which doesn't allow the destruction of nation states. This kind of stuff. This is like the whole climate we have right now. You're not going to see any discussion of any of that stuff anywhere in the media. You're not going to see it on Fox. You're not going to see it in Democracy Now! You're not going to see it on CBS. You're not going to see it in New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times, for that matter. There is such a unified opinion about the fact that Trump is an existential threat to something without a real statement of, real statement of clarity about exactly what that thing is. Because the thing that we're talking about is the order that's been constructed since post-war, since 1945, really, but more particularly since the 70s. And that is the hegemony of those people who have hegemonic power in the United States and, at the time, Western Europe and, say, Japan and South Korea. So they felt and they almost expressed that hegemonic power across the planet. They're seeing it challenged on the ground. We saw it pretty widely challenged in Africa. And Gaddafi was a focal point of that, along with Mandela and what happened in several places in the African continent in the second bloom of independence against colonialism. The first one, being perhaps squashed with the murder and dissection of Lumumba and others. We also saw it in Latin America with Hugo Chavez being elected in 1998, and the project of integration, protection of national sovereignty, sort of repudiation of the Monroe Doctrine, et cetera, and some successful blooms of this, including Daniel Ortega, for example, being reelected with a very high margin in Nicaragua, the election of Lenin Moreno in Ecuador last month, I guess it was now, a lot of things, but all over, there's been a battle to try to reinstate this hegemony that was pretty much established until the system started collapsing and people started pushing back. And Trump is kind of an odd duck inside that process because he seems to favor, and more importantly, I believe, or in any event, some folks on the other side strongly believe, he represents a group inside the elite and or outside the elite that sees a different path for the United States, not one of hegemony for the ruling clique here, but rather one where the United States is one nation, maybe first among equals. In other words, rather than being exceptional, the only nation, it is maybe first among many nations. That is an intolerable concept for those who have had, basically had sway over U.S. and EU and Japanese and South Korean and other foreign policy, really since 1945. That's the big conflict right now, in my opinion.
Right. So the point that occurs to me that you have mentioned, and which seems to also interestingly be mentioned by people, but in a much more rather frightened manner, is the fact that we've got a large swath of people who are in this kind of ideological and political limbo. You've got these people who are anti-war. They've gravitated around a candidate that is, campaigning to the left of Hillary Clinton when it comes to war and peace.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that constituency is quite openly and obviously beholden to, at least we could say, the ideology of white supremacy, not necessarily white nationalism in the style of, say, a fascist movement, but certainly they don't have a grasp on, Du Bois and critical race theory that stems out of his work.
I agree with the last part of that statement, which I would generalize to the entire American population, by the way,
Right.
with the exception of maybe 1,000 people. No. See, this is something that's a fiction net. it's a widely held one. It may end up being true, although the data indicates otherwise. But, one of the things that, and I'm glad you mentioned Du Bois, for example, in this context. Tony Montero and I were at the Republican National Convention for its entirety, and he's a Du Boisian scholar. In fact, he's among Americans maybe preeminent Du Boisian scholar, and since Du Bois was an American, among other things, that puts him pretty high up the rank globally among Du Boisian scholars. He didn't see that at all, and neither did I. We saw people who were working class, who were conscious of their class and not their race. They were not voting for Trump because he was a white nationalist.
Certainly.
They were Republicans, perhaps, because the Republican Party since 1964 or 1968 catered to that. And by the way, the Democratic Party was the party of white nationalism, white supremacy until that time, and never repudiated it, really. There were just chunks of it that were taken over by people who were fighting it. But you won't find a document somewhere. Hi, this is the Democratic Party. We hereby repudiate our entire history of white supremacy, nationalism, blah, 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 blah. And here we are now doing this. You see fights over symbolic little things in the various platforms over the years that symbolize that to people, but you haven't seen that happen. So let's be clear about this is the United States of America, okay? White supremacy, white nationalism, all of that stuff, fundamental ideological perspective of the country, the founders, the opponents, everybody. Perhaps the most successful proponent of white nationalism in the 21st century thus far was Barack Obama. Look at AFRICOM. Okay? AFRICOM became an entity in October of 2008, a month before the election. It was based in Stuttgart, Germany. Not a single American base on the African continent. Okay? Muammar Gaddafi and others organizing Africa along the same lines that had occurred in Latin America with Hugo Chavez. Let's integrate politically, economically, stand up for each other's sovereignty, self-determination, all these things. Gaddafi, I'll bankroll it. Here's money. I was at international conference in Tripoli in 2009, where there were people from the entire continent working on exactly that project. Gaddafi there saying, here, what do you guys need, etc. What does Obama do? Son of Africa. His father was African, came here directly from the continent, not dragged here in chains like many people, African Americans in the United States. And so he's first generation. What does he do? He blows up Gaddafi, presides over his rape and murder, destroys the country on the basis of wealth and organization, ends up leaving the United States in command and control of the militaries of 35 African countries. Even Cecil Rhodes didn't accomplish that.
Right.
So, Trump is a white supremacist, but what is Barack Obama, to paraphrase Tony Montero?
We were talking about the issue of the Trump base and building a movement or organization that would include them, and the operative point for me is overcoming some of the obstacles that are real and some of those that are just imposed by the media on those groups. And I'm curious what your thinking is in that regard.
Well, you have a few things that fall into this. First is a reality check, in essence. People that are looking at politics in general, whether it's they're looking at Trump and what to do about Trump, or the electoral system, whatever. Those people have to be scientific about what they're doing, and presumably they have goals. And those goals, of course, once you lay it out, you chart a path from where you are in reality to, the place that your destination where you intend to end up. If people are looking at liberation of any kind here, particularly from a working class perspective, there is no way to, the socialist revolution, even to liberal democracy, whatever the hell that is, without some measure of unity in the working class. Certainly, abandoning the white working class as hopelessly irredeemable, and all of the words that we heard over the course of the campaign means a failure of any serious progressive agenda. You are not going to achieve any goals, whether it's putting an end to racism, sexism, misogyny, all of the things that people claim that they're in favor of, by writing off, a good chunk of the working class as being irredeemable, racist, and unworthy of attention. So it's urgent that this problem be addressed. That's at the foundation of the answer to the question, and then it becomes a question of how does one get from here to there on that particular aspect of it. In other words, how do we achieve a working class unity? It's not even a hint of it that's there, but rather a very large example of it, which is if you actually listen to the various manifestations of working class activity, you see people rising behind Trump, what it is that they're, rising around, rising behind Sanders, what is it that they're rising around, rising in the streets, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter or, any other, hundreds of, different things, particularly large things like immigrants' rights and, anti-racist struggles, all of that. There are some very common demands that are made. That's the basis for unity. We want jobs. We want peace. The revolution in Russia wasn't made on the basis, of the demands of land and peace for no reason. These are things that people need and want. If you raise the demand, you look around to see who else is raising it, and that's who you unify with. Well, that need exists across the working class. The way to deny those things to the members of the working class is to divide the working class and set it upon itself, one piece, one part against another, rather than looking at the common needs, which are, we need food, clothing, shelter, secure jobs, and peace above all things. In the context of war, none of the others are possible. And so we have to look to each other to build, these bridges basically on common demands, and they're fairly simple. And again, they've been exhibited pretty regularly by almost every, group of workers that have been set in motion into the political world.
Mm-hmm. So I've also, in the time that we've been working around this conversation, talked with Tony Montero, and he has agreed that part of understanding the Trump ascent and election has to be understood within the context of the black vote, and specifically the fact that so many African Americans simply stayed home rather than voting for Hillary Clinton. And it wasn't tied to voter suppression as much as just absenteeism as a very passive effort to deny her that victory. And from that, he says, we talked about James Baldwin and how Baldwin describes how African Americans regard whites in the way that a mother regards a child, and this is almost a paradigm equivalent to, okay, baby's gonna touch the hot stove and we just gotta let him have at it. If you want Trump, guys, he's yours. And so I wonder what your thoughts are in that regard.
Well, I agree. First of all, Tony's the social scientist out of the two of us. Okay, I'm like the whatever the commentator, but he's looking at the data, so he's better positioned than I am, certainly, to discuss the relative numbers, more or less, who did what and what motivates them. I agree with the bulk of what you just said, however, and I can't think of a point of disagreement. The situation is such that what do you call it? The basically the alternative to Trump was Hillary Clinton. Really should be framed as Trump was the alternative to Hillary Clinton, because Clinton is what the system produced, and Trump is what was produced in reaction to that within the limited confines of someone that could afford to run a campaign against a $2 billion campaign, someone that could compel media coverage even when they were saying something that the media didn't want to broadcast, like NATO is obsolete and no more regime change and all of that. Normally what they do is they turn off the microphone when people say things, out of school. But when they did that with Trump, they found that their viewership tanked. And, as we've seen in the expose that came out in the last couple of days about CNN, the primary motivating factor for management at CNN and other places has nothing to do with journalism or facts or truth, really. It has to do with whatever they can say that's going to boost their numbers and their ad revenue. Right. It is a business. This is the way they look at it. So, it's people reacting to that whole paradigm. It doesn't deliver for me. They're calling me out again, to go support them, and there's nothing in it for me. People finally said, you know what? There's nothing in it for me. I'm staying out of it. And you saw that as a decisive part of the outcome in Philadelphia, for example. I'm certain that Professor Montero has that correct, and that from there, Pennsylvania goes as a consequence of that, and ultimately the election goes as a consequence of that. And so I believe, although I don't have the data in front of me to cite it, that there are a number of places in the country where groups that traditionally have supported the Democratic Party, where they didn't outright support Trump or a third-party candidate, sat on their hands deliberately saying, we are not going to support this. This is a candidate that wants World War III. I mean, I think that was pretty obvious to a lot of people with the way the campaign was run. And she has said some and done some pretty disgusting things over the course of her career that leaves her no position of moral high ground vis-a-vis Trump or anybody else. And so we're staying out of it. And right. I think that is the vote. The voter suppression, the largest part of it, and I'm not in a position, again, to actually quantify this, but I suspect as much of the voter suppression came from the history of Hillary Clinton as a politician and the Democratic Party over the last 30 or 40 years as it did from all of the crackers and lawsuits and everything else, playing games, in all of the places that they have done traditionally. I'm not trying to minimize that, but I am trying to instead show that the revolt against the system is of such a scale that it is either on par or perhaps even eclipses this other institutional wrong.
I gotcha. And just one more thought very quickly because of the time we're facing. What are your thoughts about the idea that the Trump base has an antecedent, at least in some regard, within the Ron Paul candidacies of the previous two electoral cycles?
There have been within both parties and outside also various formations that have sort of coalesced in opposition to the system. The system isn't really serving anyone but the elite, and it is so rigged that it's not really possible to, we've seen certainly again with Sanders, it's nearly impossible to organize an oppositional grouping and succeed at capturing the presidential nomination for one of the two parties. Trump perhaps being the first exception to that in a long time, if it turns out that's what he is. I'm not certain on that, but I suspect it's possible. So, the Ron Paul group is certainly an oppositional group. There are others in both the Republican and Democratic parties that have, tried to coalesce and been, thrown around, and can go back to Jesse Jackson, for example, in the 80s, whatever. So I'm certain that there is an overlap between Ron Paul group and Trump supporters, and certainly also with Sanders supporters and that ended up voting for Trump, and some others like that. So I think it's plausible for sure.
That's all we got for the time for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and I want to remind you again, America's greatest social democratic period corresponded with the lives of those wonderful commies, Larry, Curly, and Moe.